The atmosphere at Coalface Green, now known as Gota Gogama, pulses with people. Tens of thousands have arrived from every corner of Sri Lanka to smell the salt air and hear the sounds of change. It is Ramadan, and men and women sit to break fast together. A few feet away, a group is listening to a guitar. But atop the barricades of the Presidential Secretariat sit a group of sunburned young people who have been there since the first days of this civil movement. Their throats are hoarse from screaming, and they demand answers to their current plight. They demand change. Then suddenly, two buses pass each other a few feet away, their horns trumpet an unmistakable chant that has become an anthem of the protests. This is part 3 of the story of Sri Lanka's economic history, a drama in 5 parts. Last week, we left 1952 Sri Lanka facing the toughest challenge of its short independence. Demand for its rubber exports has cratered, and rice prices have shot up by 40%. The country desperately seeks financial aid from the US, which isn't coming through. Enter the People's Republic of China. The communist country needs rubber for its rapid development. But the West is preventing this. The UN even passes a resolution preventing its members from selling rubber to China. And Sri Lanka must lower the price of rice, which China had bought and hoarded. There was only one thing to be done. It was controversial, and it was known as the Ceylon-China Trade Agreement, informally known as the Rubber-Rice Pact. The Americans are not happy. On several occasions previously, they had intervened in sales of Ceylonese rubber to the USSR, but this time was different. Their ambassador calls on Finance Minister Sir Oliver Gunathilaka on a hot Colombo afternoon to express his displeasure. But Sir Oliver has none of it. He goes into a lengthy tirade at Ambassador Satterthwaite and America's previous efforts to thwart Ceylon's trade with their enemies. It doesn't work. The US government invokes the Battle Act, banning assistance to countries who support the Soviet Union, and American aid to Ceylon is cut off. And the trade agreement itself? Unusually, Sri Lanka benefited both ways, buying rice at below global market prices and selling rubber to China at above market. The withdrawal of American aid and an embargo on Ceylon deprives the agricultural sector of vital chemicals, making food even more expensive. With its finances strained, the government of Dudley Senanayake starts pushing the envelope on how much it can borrow, and government debt rises rapidly. Sri Lanka then gets on a road paved with good intentions. The World Bank and the IMF were in town to discuss a capital spending plan to develop power, health and agriculture. They had suggested a program of 1.6 billion rupees, while the government wanted 2.6 billion. In exchange, Ceylon had to promise to do 2 things: gradually phase out state enterprises started during the Second World War, and gradually eliminate food subsidies. Then, in July 1953, with its finances in crisis and the potential to avert disaster with a World Bank-backed development package, the government hastily pulls back on the rice subsidy, causing rice prices to skyrocket. Food becomes unaffordable, and people are brought to their knees. On the 12th of August, a widespread general strike or Hartal was announced. There is social unrest, met with violence from the state. Prime Minister Dudley Senanayake promptly resigns, and even the new Finance Minister J.R. Jayawardena loses his portfolio. By 1956, Sri Lanka elects a new Prime Minister. His name is SWRD Bandaranaike, who comes to power after a stirring campaign around majoritarian Sinhala Buddhist sentiment and a promise to make Sinhala the national language. The promises feel fresh to many citizens who felt alienated by the United National Party. When SWRD's Sri Lanka Freedom Party comes into power, they use organized labor to corral voting blocks and started establishing their own trade unions. The UNP, not wanting to be left out, does the same. This increases the number of unions with sometimes aligned but often conflicting demands. Economists view the first decade of independent Ceylon as one of missed industrialization. Money earned from exports went to fund day-to-day needs, and hardly any of it was used to invest in new industries. For the sake of comparison, let's look at 2 other countries with a roughly similar starting point, economically speaking. In 1948, Sri Lanka's per capita GDP, meaning income per person, was around $100, nearly identical to Korea, and not very far from war-ravaged Japan at $170. Just over 10 years later, Honda Motors of Japan had built up enough expertise to enter the US market. In another 10 years, it became the biggest seller of motorcycles. In a single decade, Japan's GDP per capita went up 10 times while Sri Lanka's had barely moved to $162. By 1960, Sri Lanka's per capita income was $144, not far behind Korea at $158, which had just concluded an expensive war. Korea then shifts, using development grants to promote technology exports. In 1970, the Samsung Corporation makes their first shipment of black and white TV sets to South America. Where Sri Lanka had only added $40 per capita income in 10 years, Korea's had nearly doubled. It was an era of missed opportunities. It is 1960, and Sri Lanka's reserves are halved to just $100 million. Citizens are vulnerable as 50% of the import bill is food. The country is now led by the world's first female Prime Minister, Sirimavo Bandaranaike, at the helm of her late husband's party, and it is belt-tightening time. The budget that year bans several imports, while increasing duties on items like cars and liquor. Luxury fabrics and watches were banned outright. By 1964, almost everything was banned, and only essential medicines, fuel, fertilizers, and food could be imported by special license. This may sound familiar. Once she'd closed off the economy, Bandaranaike exercised what she believed to be her ideological, anti-colonial solution to Sri Lanka's economic malaise. She believed that a centrally planned system, where the state allocated resources, would thrust the country's development forward. To provide some relief to the balance of payments, which was in continuous crisis, Sri Lanka could manufacture anything it imported instead. This was called import substitution. The government offers incentives and tariff protection for those wanting to start manufacturing operations that support import substitution, and by 1963, nearly 2,000 new homegrown industrial businesses are started. They focus on consumer products and without either foreign investment or technical assistance are relatively limited in their scope and technology. They were also offered protection by way of high tariffs on imports until they matured. The result was the birth of a new protected class of capitalists. But Ceylon did not have the raw materials to manufacture these goods, so they still relied on imports, which were then converted to finished products. Also, because the local market was small, the new factories were underused. Also, latest technologies were not used, so the final product was more expensive to consumers than imported counterparts. Because of these limitations and the need to meet employment obligations, alongside private businesses stood a stable of state-owned enterprises to fill the gap for everything from cement to footwear. These state corporations were failures. First, without much direction, they indiscriminately entered into capital-intensive industries, which by their nature had low employment requirements. Second, instead of experienced business managers, favored political allies were in charge, resulting in inefficiencies. This resulted in losses to the state, a poor quality of output, the state competing directly with private enterprise, and much lower employment numbers than projected. Western capitalist governments viewed state-directed investments with suspicion, never knowing what kind of advantages state enterprises over private companies had. So Ceylon was boycotted by most international governments and investors followed. While Bandaranaike continued to assert that her government was friendly and non-aligned to any particular nation, she was forced to become more dependent on capital and support from left-leaning countries like the USSR and China, which she used to fund her nationalization program. She also ventured into delicate terrain. British Shell Oil and American Caltex were two large petroleum companies which imported 80% of the country's oil from its wells in the Middle East, but pricing was pegged to an unrelated market of North America. The companies made good profits. In 1961, the Petroleum Corporation was established to open up alternative sources, like the USSR, with an intent to save on foreign exchange. In February 1963, a gazette was issued fixing the maximum imported price of fuel. This hit Western governments right between the eyes. But the Petroleum Corporation needed to lease storage facilities from Shell and Caltex, who by now saw the writing on the wall for their continued operations in the country. In January 1964, the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation became the only entity that could import and distribute most types of fuel to the country, and the foreign players had to withdraw. We were back to the age of state monopolies. A year later, for the second time in its 15-year independence, the United States suspends aid to Ceylon. The country was now teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. In the 1965 elections, Bandaranaike loses to the conservative, pro-Western UNP leader Dudley, who resigned after the 1953 Hartal but had regained momentum under worsening living conditions for the citizenry. The pendulum was now going to swing back. He began by unwinding the links that had been formed between Ceylon and communist nations. To mollify Western countries, he agreed to pay compensation of 55 million rupees to the nationalized US and British oil companies over 5 years. Sri Lanka-US relations normalized shortly thereafter. Sri Lanka's foreign currency reserves had been in free fall during Bandaranaike's premiership, but it is about to get worse. For the second time in a UNP-led government, there is a global shortage of rice which drives prices up by nearly 50% at the same time as an export crash. By 1966, the UNP had to declare a state of emergency to stave off food riots. Senanaike was never able to resuscitate exports despite major devaluations in the currency, nor was he able to attract significant foreign investments, except for credit from the IMF. Over the second half of the decade, until 1970, foreign currency reserves fell 60% to $40 million. The rice ration was halved and remained at this level throughout the administration. Children born during this period of extreme rationing and shortage were born significantly underweight. A 1976 survey shows that 1/3 of young children in rural Sri Lanka were stunted from malnutrition. This went up to 60% in the estate sector, and a fifth were wasted, meaning they were at risk of death. There are two ways Ceylon contained outflows of foreign currency. They restricted imports or borrowed from its citizens by increasing interest rates. Now the central bank had only one lever left. It had to borrow more. New import duties were introduced, but the central bank also raises the interest rate 4 times through 1969 from 2.5% to 9%. And it started to borrow commercially. Also weirdly, to encourage export-oriented manufacturing, the government introduces a dual exchange rate system. Exports were given lower rupee rates, and imports for manufacturing were on higher rupee rates. Senanaike and his UNP government, who had been vocally opposed to the command and control of the Ceylonese economy under Bandaranaike, struggled to substantially implement the market solutions they were so passionate about once at the helm. During the period 1965 to 1970, the government's liabilities grew fourfold, with inflation running rampant. This administration had also attempted to appease Buddhist clergy, and during this time, Poya came to be a national holiday. The UNP-led government never recovered from the political setback. Halving of the rice ration, and with several people on food stamps, they were voted out in 1970. Sirimavo Bandaranaike was back in charge after having formed a left-wing coalition called the United Left Front. The promises made were radical and built on the work she and her policymakers had begun earlier. These included a program of land reforms, increased subsidies for rice, and nationalization of major enterprises, altogether known as the Common Program. The pendulum swung back again. Emboldened by the coalition winning 118 of the 135 seats in parliament, Ms. Bandaranaike's government doubles down on doctrine. They quickly oppose the Tamil-led parties, including the Ceylon Workers' Congress, the preeminent union representing the rights of Indian estate workers. They also sought to promote their theory of non-alignment, which was essentially anti-capitalist and anti-Western in philosophy. They lost no time in re-establishing diplomatic relations with all the leading communist nations. And economically, they wanted to subordinate private enterprise. The early 1970s were also characterized by global oil price shocks, a doubling of global oil prices from $32 per barrel to over $65 per barrel. Sri Lanka imported all of its crude oil from Iran to be refined into petroleum products at an Iranian-sponsored oil refinery in Sapugaskanda, and was hit hard. The economy closed again, and imports were tightly controlled by licensing. Foreign exchange was rationed based on past performance industry and decided by the Ministry of Industries. Letters of credit, which are bank guarantees to importers, needed to be underwritten by a foreign bank if they were to be accepted by traders. Then, the State Industrial Corporation Act allowed for the setting up of new state corporations, followed by the Business Undertaking Acquisition Bill, which allowed for the legal expropriation of private enterprise. By 1976, 26 enterprises had been nationalized under this law. But because intermediate goods needed to be imported and foreign exchange was scarce, industries started contracting and could not import or produce at sufficient scale. An import restriction committee was formed to meet and decide which goods to restrict. The State Trading Corporation imported essential commodities and accounted for nearly 90% of imports, as well as a third of exports. The country had to turn inwards to local production. This created an important feature of the structure of Sri Lanka's economy, traces of which are still detected today. Only large, diversified companies could afford the foreign exchange needed to import and serve the local market. Also, many of these enterprises had essential revenue lines, so they would never be disadvantaged, and import licenses could be obtained through clerks in the Ministry of Industry with a bribe. The second was that manufacturing was so cost-ineffective and imports so expensive that barely any value was added to the final product to make it affordable. In addition to scarcity, the quality of locally produced goods, particularly from state enterprises, were bad. Journalist Tazi Vitachi, writing his column for the Times of Ceylon, joked that the only thing that did not strike was a locally manufactured matchstick. Locally manufactured clothing was of such appalling quality that Sri Lanka's one-time Prime Minister Wijayananda Dahanayake stood in a textile queue dressed only in a loincloth. Medicines were in short supply and could only be imported from communist countries, with prescriptions written just for a week. Enormous queues at state hospitals could be skipped with a bribe. New houses were restricted to 1,200 square feet, and inferior quality building materials, when they were available, were only supplied by state corporations. One time, a local producer claimed to be manufacturing margarine and was able to get imports banned. As it turns out, the margarine was just solidified coconut oil. There were so many state corporations, there was one even for jute hessian, the material also known as burlap, used to make sacks. The leader of the opposition, Junius Richard Jayawardena, commented derisively that there were government corporations for everything, including gunny bags, and that the chairman of this corporation was a Goni Billa. The island then becomes unstable. By 1971, a Maoist youth movement known as the People's Liberation Front, also known as the JVP, staged an insurgency with the intention to establish a socialist state. The government comes perilously close to being overthrown. The year after, Bandaranaike's government offers its citizens their first constitution, creating a new republic. The constitution was deeply objectionable to many, codifying laws that favored the Sinhalese over all other races. The tragedy and folly of Bandaranaike's husband's legacy followed her, ensuring that Lanka would have no way out of the boiling pot without bloodshed. Sri Lanka struggled to attract any meaningful foreign investment and had to rely on communist allies for resources to develop its exports, mostly tea, again through central planning and government committees. By 1976, after 7 years in power, the Sirimavo government was starting to wane, having been characterized by extreme control and a nearly crippling insurgency. Waiting in the wings was J.R. Jayawardena, the leader of the United National Party and one-time finance minister. He sought to move his party's image away from representing the affluents and elites, and did this by establishing a powerful grassroots movement to appeal to youth, now numbering significantly among the 1.5 million unemployed. Running a command and control system that intervened in people's daily lives and having alienated the majority of its allies, Bandaranaike's United Left Front had plunged the economy into stark territory. It was the worst defeat that a leftist government has faced to date in independent Sri Lanka. Jayawardena was a very different sort of UNPer. His winning formula was to be a progressive figurehead who could also be the custodian of the hopes and dreams of a Sinhalese majority. He fashioned himself as a Sinhalese Buddhist monarch with lineage stretching back to the founding of Lanka. He wore pure white national dress and aimed to create a righteous society, the Dharmishta Samajaya. In its campaign, the UNP had promised that an open economy and market-friendly policies would be the answer to Sri Lanka's hardships, an economic ideology termed neoliberalism. His plan was to open up, stimulate the economy, and put people back into work. On his side, he had benign global economic conditions, stable global oil prices, and speed. Because of his parliamentary majority, he could enact reforms without much political opposition. So, he was quick. The import-substituting industrialists who would be most affected could only regroup to present their arguments against liberalization much later. Meanwhile, there was trouble brewing. The leader of the Tamil United Liberation Front, the largest opposition party, had elevated their demands from regional self-government to a separate state, or ELAM. But then, TULF leader SJV Chelvanayakam, whom you may remember from our SWRD story, dies, leaving a vacuum of leadership. A new underground separatist movement comes in to fill the chasm. They were called the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elam, known as the LTTE. In 1978, JR passes a new constitution modifying the Westminster-style parliament by adding a powerful position, the executive president. He also established a trade union with paramilitary scope, the Jatika Sevaka Sangamaya. Sri Lanka was at a boiling point. Barbaric rioting had erupted all over the island within 2 weeks of the swearing in of the new cabinet. It is under this backdrop of a powerful president, a diminished parliament, and violence that Sri Lanka attempts economic liberalization for the second time. But there are some things going in their favor. Global tea prices had significantly improved the country's export position. The central bank felt confident enough to float the rupee, abandoning the dual rate system. The crises of previous years was seen as a culmination of setting an unrealistic exchange rate which filtered down into distorted pricing unrelated to market conditions. This was compounded by controlling the quantities of imports, which resulted in shortage and hardship. To make matters even worse, the state ran its own enterprises, which were loss-making, forcing the government to borrow to cover these costs. When the exchange rate was floated, demand for and from Sri Lanka could be met by supply at a price determined by these factors, interrupted only by a tariff. Domestic controls and monopolies were unwound, encouraging private companies to compete with each other. Then there was the flood of aid. Foreign aid flowed into the country, becoming nearly a fifth of government spending, as Western powers scrambled to underwrite their support for a market-oriented government. Around the same time, Sri Lanka's foreign currency reserves started benefiting from workers who had left in previous decades, remitting some of their earnings in foreign exchange back to the island. And of course, tourists started coming. The government, eager to launch its development program, picked up a slew of projects, often in close collaboration with donors. If you watched episode 1, Megasthenes had described Sri Lanka as an island divided by a river. Not straying too far from the theme of medieval kings who controlled and diverted scarce water, JR was going to be the one to tame the mighty Mahaweli. Project 1 was a massive irrigation scheme and hydroelectric power plant called the Accelerated Mahaweli River Development Program. Accelerated because what was planned over 30 years was done in 6. Over 10 years, 450 megawatts of hydroelectric power came online at a cost of $2 billion. To get the project's full intended benefits, multiple new downstream projects were also needed. It was this network of new development projects that pushed the country's borrowing. The next project was Export Processing Zones, or EPZs, north of Colombo. The Greater Colombo Economic Commission, which later became the Board of Investment, was established to attract trade. It was directed by JR's cousin and business magnate, Upali Vijayawardena. The GCEC had full discretion to attract foreign partners in order to diversify exports away from the tea and rubber which Sri Lanka had produced for generations. The main attraction of the EPZ was that it was to be free from unions, located close to the port and airport, and a host of generous incentives and tax holidays. Investors could own 100% of the company's setup, repatriate their profits and dividends unrestricted, and of course, there was a lot of extraordinarily generous tax incentives. The zones went on to become major sources of employment, successfully exporting finished garments, especially to the United States, and simplified trade. But they lost tax revenue over long periods, and the GCEC's total discretion over these tax holidays could not be shaken off for generations. It was around this time that a new import tax, known as the cess, was introduced to fund the Export Development Board, a new government institution. Bad habits were hard to shake. Economic growth was ticking back up to the high single digits. The resulting inflation was suppressed with a sharp acceleration of short-term interest rates. By 1980, the central bank reported an 81% increase in investment to 24 billion rupees, mostly as equipment and machinery for manufacturing, construction and transportation sectors. The strategy appeared to be paying off. In 1987, the third project was launched, focused on housing and rural development under the Gam Udawa, or reawakening of the village. Art, industry and business exhibitions were held around the island to much fanfare, with performances from great artists of the time. This was all done under the very exacting directions of JR's next in line, Prime Minister Ranasinghe Premadasa, who left a strong impression on civil servants organizing the events. The fourth project was the construction of a new parliamentary complex in Sri Javardhanapura Kotte, the official capital of Sri Lanka. But all this was happening against a background of increased violence, terror and insecurity for the citizens of the country. Early on, the government introduced the Prevention of Terrorism Act, a piece of legislation that has haunted the country since its inception and has led to the torture, disappearance and killings of thousands. The situation escalated in May 1981 with violence in Jaffna, resulting in arson attacks, including the destruction of the Jaffna Public Library. This triggered an island-wide pogrom against Tamils, followed by severe massacres in 1983. The civil war between the Sri Lankan state and Tamil nationalist militias, led by the LTTE, had begun. J.R. Jayawardene used the opportunity to consolidate power. He extended the term of members of parliament for another 6 years through a referendum which cancelled the 1983 parliamentary election. This was despite him barring former Prime Minister Sirimavo Bandaranaike from active politics for having tried the same thing. He also outlawed the major opposition party, the TULF, by passing an amendment to the constitution which banned any MP who supported a separate state. This move left the UNP almost unopposed. But he was getting on in age, 77 years old now, and the UNP needed a successor. The reform agenda slowly started to lose momentum until it came to a standstill. With many things still left undone, the government was still in deficit. Remember those loss-making enterprises of the previous regime? Most of them continue to exist as they were politically popular. They were funded by taxpayers and borrowings, which the government made easier for themselves by capping the interest rate. While engaged in a major civilian conflict in the north, and by 1987 they faced rumblings from the south. The Marxist Janata Vimukti Peramuna had taken up arms and, using guerrilla tactics, started raiding military and civilian targets. Several assassinations of political and public figures happened during this time, with both the JVP and the state blaming each other. As violence escalated, so did the need to borrow and finance military activities. External debt quadrupled in the early 80s, and official reserves were run down to plug the current account deficit. The government had to borrow commercially again. The process of economic reform, which was at best incomplete, had to be put on hold. During this time, another tax, a surcharge of 5%, was added on import duties with a few exceptions for essential commodities. Imports were slowly starting to get more expensive. In 1988, finally there is a presidential election. Prime Minister Ranasinghe Premadasa, who had led the Gam Udawa project, which everyone agreed was a success, was elected president. He was a hands-on leader, known to be frugal and honest, and an outlier to the political elite of the United National Party. But most importantly, he would be the UNP's populist candidate. Ranasinghe Premadasa's government responded with wholesale violence to the JVP Insurgency, which concluded in 1989. The death toll was estimated to be as high as 60,000. Youth were especially vulnerable to abductions, both in the Northeast conflict as well as the JVP Insurgency. Families emigrated or sent their children away during this time. Since the 1987 Indo-Lanka Peace Accord, India agreed to stop supporting Tamil separatist elements in the north, but maintained a military presence in the north. The Indian Peacekeeping Force, the IPKF, arrived on the island to quell troubles with the LTTE. But during the 3 years, sentiment towards them changed dramatically, particularly from nationalist elements who saw their presence as invasive. President Premadasa then made a fatal miscalculation. To appease the nationalist elements, he armed the LTTE against the IPKF. Once the IPKF were recalled to India in March 1990, the LTTE used their new resources to escalate the conflict. Premadasa's government started losing international support for its approach to state-sanctioned violence towards its political enemies and widespread human rights violations. He was an authoritarian, dismissing his cabinet members and diplomats and instead confiding in his valet. In May 1991, he even ordered the British High Commissioner to leave the country after he reported voting irregularities at a local council election. Premadasa later said, "There are those who still think they are our colonial masters." Needing to fund a growing conflict but having alienated donors and international investors thinning out, the country's finances were in trouble. Premadasa turned to privatization in order to reform the expensive state sector, a task left largely incomplete by his predecessor. Sri Lanka had to be self-reliant for another time in its not even half-century of independence. Premadasa declared the 1990s the decade of exports. The IMF's nearly $700 million package under the controversial Structural Adjustment Facility supported several changes. To aid this, the rupee was devalued significantly by nearly 20% in 1989 and then again at the end of 1993. Tax holidays were granted to any exporter who met the government's criteria, regardless of whether they were in an export zone or not. Corporate taxes were lowered, while import tariffs were simplified and export tariffs were phased out. Wealth and capital gain taxes were abolished to restart the capital markets. By the end of 1993, 35 state-owned enterprises were now owned by private shareholders, and another 30 were going through the process. For a long time, Sri Lanka's prices had nothing to do with the world market. Gradually, a system was introduced to link prices of wheat and fertilizer with the rest of the world. To alleviate poverty, the cash value of food stamps was doubled, and a major poverty alleviation project, the Jana Savya program, was launched in 1989. With the success of the apparel sector in EPZs, another 200 garment factories in rural areas were established, aiming to promote employment and reduce regional disparities. The economy grew annually at between 5 and 6% until 1993, despite major conflicts raging in the country, and almost all of this came from manufacturing garments for exports. To do all this, the private sector needed to be provided with significant tax holidays, which kicked the can down the road. Interest rates were also high, stifling manufacturing competitiveness, and public debt grew to nearly 500 billion rupees, equal to the full national output. Then, on the 1st of May 1993, the president is expected at a May Day rally. He is in a procession, heading from Sugatadasa Stadium, which will march to Golface Green. At 12:45 p.m., he is at the Armour Street Grand Pass Junction when 23-year-old Kulaveerasingham Veerakumar of the LTTE, known as Babu, quietly parks his bicycle and starts walking briskly towards him. Catch us next week on Patta History to find out what happens next, as this Sri Lanka is plunged into another roller coaster of uncertainty. A special thanks to our Patreon members for their continued support. To learn more about the benefits of Patreon membership, click on the link in our description box.